Hey, welcome to episode 3 of You Can Quote Me on This. Today we have an interview with Laura Michael Brown, professor at Iowa State University. We're going to talk about the Greensboro Sit-Ins, the women that helped organize it, and how we remember history. So without further ado, let's get this show on the road. Welcome to episode 3 of You Can Quote Me on This. I'm Burbank.
And I am Martin.
And we are here today with our special guest, our first interview of this, even though this is our 3rd episode, our first interview, and we couldn't ask for a better interviewee. This is Dr. Laura Michael Brown. She is a professor of rhetoric at Iowa State University. And explain, what is rhetoric? We're like typing it up. What in the world is rhetoric?
What is this?
I had to type it in today. I didn't know what it was. I've heard that word so many times, but I've never actually looked at it before.
So usually you hear it, a lot of times you hear it like on the news, people use rhetoric as a bad word. It always bothers me. Oh, that's just rhetoric. Oh, this overblown rhetoric. And people use it to mean language that's like manipulative or like overdone or super flowery, like language that you shouldn't take seriously. And
so you manipulate people. Is that what you do?
That's what I do. And I teach other people how to do it.
Can I get into that?
I like it.
No. That is rhetoric, but also like basically everything is rhetoric. So what I teach is how to understand communication through rhetorical theories. So it's just a set of concepts and principles that help us understand like how communication works, how persuasion works. So what makes an argument effective or ineffective? And obviously those questions aren't always very easy to answer, but I think that's what makes it really interesting.
And I'm glad they have a teacher like you to be able to do that. And so we're so excited. Now, we have Laura here today because...
Hey, Mr. Burbank, check this out. Before, we forgot something.
Oh, we did forget something.
Yeah, because you know what?
I want to jump right in and learn this.
Let's jump in, but before we do, I want to see what kind of mug Laura brought today. Before she does, let's you know what? She's the guest. Let her go first. Yes, let her go first.
This is such an honor. So I brought my cat mug.
Oh, okay. Now, why cat? Now, do you have any cats?
I have 3 cats, and they are. See, now Martin's looking at me like, uh-oh.
we got the crazy cat lady here for an interview.
That's fine. I'll own it proudly.
I wasn't going to jump into any cat lady stereotypes, but since you brought it up, I'll let you have that one.
It's all right. This mug is very special because when you get to the end, when you drink all your coffee, there's another little cat at the bottom of the mug.
Oh my goodness.
Do you ever find cat hairs in your
I have no comment on that issue.
If you need to take a break and cough up a hairball or something, you let us know.
Oh no, it's not that bad.
No, I can. Hank, was it Hank?
Yes.
Harriet and Floyd. No, Lloyd.
Yeah.
I keep trying to call him Floyd.
It's basic. It's most of the way there.
Well, I love your mug. I have the plaid one today. I got my Scottish mug. So we got some plaid. I'm gonna.
Okay.
It looks kind of Christmassy, like you're still in the holidays.
We haven't put it away yet.
I like it. I
like
like
it. Kind of Christmassy. Yeah.
Yeah. I brought a mug too.
Martin, try to beat that mug.
I don't know. I probably won't be able to. I got a mug. It was a gift that was just recently given to me, and it's a Grogu mug. So a lot of people are probably going to say like Baby Yoda or something, but it's actually Grogu from the Mandalorian series, which is
Oh, that's it. Baby Yoda has his own name.
Yeah. So, and wait.
Hopefully, I didn't.
Normally we say spoiler alert before we spoil it, but I guess we're just spoiled alert.
Yeah. Oh well, they'd be okay.
They'll if they haven't seen it yet, or you need to watch it. All righty.
Okay.
If you have any free time during this pandemic, all righty.
Yeah, just in case I find myself with like a little bit more time at home.
Awesome. I love your mug. Thank you for sharing. Feel free to take a drink anytime. How about we just practice that? Okay, everyone
No,
take
let's do it.
There you go.
Mm,
Oh, very good. What are you drinking today, by the way, Laura?
Coffee.
Very
coffee.
good. Coffee person. Very good. I'm
How do you-
water. I got
How do
water.
you like your coffee?
I like it like pretty strong. I brew my coffee pretty strong, and then I put a little bit of milk in it.
Okay.
We're going to talk today about history. And so this is the 61st anniversary this week of the Greensboro Sit-Ins. And we're going to talk about what the Greensboro Sit-Ins are and some things that have come to light in the most recent years and become more prominent about what happened and who helped organize that. That we might have not really known before. That was kind of silent for a while. We're going to talk about that, talk about history, and I won't give too much away, but I do want to go ahead and we're so glad to have you here, Laura. And so if you don't mind, there's a lot of people out there that may have heard of the Greensboro Sit-Ins, but they may not know what in the world are the Greensboro Sit-Ins. So do you mind just taking a moment and explaining us real quick, what was life like 61 years ago? I know you weren't there, but
No,
right?
I wasn't.
Right? She is ageless, folks.
Yeah.
She is 73 years old, even though she only looks like she's 30 something. No. But can you help us understand what the environment might have been like in the 1960s? What it was
I
like?
can.
Because that's helps sets the stage for like helping us understand this a little bit.
I can try. I was not there, so I don't have a firsthand account. But I've done a lot of research around this time period. So in 1960, we're kind of in the middle of what of some of the other big civil rights movement events that most people know about. So Rosa Parks was before this. Emmett Till's murder was before this. Brown versus Board of Education was before this. But we haven't yet gotten to I Have a Dream. We haven't yet gotten to, that whole March on Washington. And we haven't yet gotten to any of the federal legislation that was passed later in the 60s. So we're kind of right in the middle of this. But I think it's important to understand, like when we look back at it, it looks like, oh, this must have just been a time period where like it was just constant. There was something huge happening every single day. And when we look at, the highlights on a timeline, it definitely looks like that. But I think it's important to think about what it might have felt like for people who were living day to day during that time. It probably felt a lot like what we're going through right now, where lots of big historic things are happening. The pandemic, we're in the middle of this period of history that's definitely going to be like an era that people refer to, but we also have to do our homework and go to our jobs and get groceries. And so there's these big things happening, but it's not like everybody just was constantly watching the next big civil rights thing happening. People are kind of living their day-to-day lives in the backdrop of all of these big historic events. So the sit-ins were a really important moment because they sort of were a big spark that got a lot of momentum for a lot of activism happening around the country. So you had some of these big moments, but in early 1960, not a ton else going on. And the sit-ins were kind of one of those flashpoint moments that everybody starts to pay attention to.
Oh, okay. So can you kind of help us understand exactly what a sit-in is, who may not know, and its purpose?
Yes. So the Greensboro sit-ins are kind of the most famous sit-ins. A lot of people, if you know anything about a sit-in, you probably know this one. But Greensboro was not the first sit-in that happened in the country. Sit-ins are kind of a tried and true activist strategy. So The basic idea is that you go into a place where for some reason you're not allowed to be. And with the sit-in, the thing that you're trying to change is the fact that you're not allowed to be in that place. Like that's the issue that the activists have. There's something wrong with the rules around who gets to be in a particular space. And so activists will go in and will literally sit in, be in that space, and have their physical presence in that space to draw attention to the fact that there's some kind of rule or there's some kind of law that's preventing them from being in that space, and to really emphasize how unjust that rule is. So in Greensboro, the space that they chose was the Woolworths counter. So Woolworths was like a drugstore, so like our like Walgreens or CVS or something, but it also had like a little restaurant, almost like a diner in it. In the one in Greensboro, there were long lunch counters lining the edge of the store, so you could do your shopping and buy your toothpaste and stuff, and then you could sit down and have a cup of coffee or a milkshake or a sandwich. So Black people were allowed to shop in the store. They were allowed to spend their money at Woolworths, but they weren't allowed to go sit at the counter. They weren't allowed to sit at the lunch counter because you have segregation laws all across the South at this point, the Jim Crow laws, we usually call them. So they thought that was pretty messed up, which it is. And so they went and they bought a few items at the store to demonstrate, like, look, we're your paying customers. We are supporting this business. We're giving you our hard-earned money.
Real quick, I don't mean to interrupt, but
no,
who are they? Do you mind telling me who are they?
Yes. Very important.
I think that would be helpful.
This is important. So the first people to sit in the Woolworths in Greensboro were 4 men from North Carolina A&T, which is one of the universities in Greensboro, which is a historically Black university.
And this is North Carolina, right? Greensboro,
yep,
North Carolina.
In Greensboro, North Carolina. So I think they were all in their first year at school, so they're college freshmen. So 4 guys.
How old is that? How old is that, Martin? You got some kids.
Freshman, you're probably 17, 18, 19 as a freshman. Pretty young.
Yeah, the youngest one was 17. And then off the top of my head, I don't remember how old the other 3 were, but they're young. They're still teenagers. So there was a group of 4 of them who were 4 friends, and they were the first ones to sort of start this. So they go into the store, they buy a few items, and then they went and sat at the lunch counter and asked if they could get a cup of coffee, if they could buy a cup of coffee. And the servers say, no, you're not allowed to sit here at the lunch counter. And they said, okay, well, we'll just wait. And they didn't get up and move when they were asked. So it's a similar strategy to, we know Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on the bus. It's a similar idea here that you're telling me I can't be in this space, but I know that that's wrong. So I'm going to come be in this space and sort of make you confront the fact that you've set up this really unjust, really absurd, when you think about it, rule about who's allowed to sit here or not.
Absolutely. And so, so these 4 guys, they did this, and it's my understanding that they were there throughout the rest of the day until it closed, right? They came in the afternoon, maybe, and they stayed there through the rest of the day.
Yeah, the first day they came a little bit later in the day. So on the first day, they didn't show up like first thing in the morning. It was a little later in the day. And yeah, they stayed until the store closed. And there are a couple of pictures of them from that first day, but it wasn't until news started to spread about that first day that then it really started to be a big deal that everybody in Greensboro was paying attention to.
Very good. And so then day after day, the crowds, my understanding, it got bigger, right?
Yes. Yeah. So they worked with students from other universities. There were lots of other students from A&T, and then students from Bennett College, which is a historically Black women's college in Greensboro. It's still a women's college today. these students were all working together, and they were super organized. They had like shifts, and they would make sure that they didn't miss their classes. So when they weren't in classes, when they had a break in classes, they would have a shift to go sit in at the counter, and they would wait at the counter until somebody came to relieve them so that they could make sure that they were giving their seat up to someone who was supportive of the sit-ins, and they weren't accidentally giving their seat up to somebody who wasn't supportive, who was trying to thwart what they were doing. So it was a pretty well-oiled machine.
So the sit-ins, so the purpose of the sit-ins, I mean, why did they choose the sit-ins rather than, standing outside, picketing or doing a march through the city? Or what did the sit-ins, why did they choose like Woolworths to sit in? How did that help?
Yeah.
It's funny. It's funny. Before you answer, it's funny you be saying Woolworth, because like I'm from Roanoke, Virginia, and I was born in '75, and we had a Woolworths there.
Really?
And I remember going to Woolworths. I was really young. I don't remember the counters then. I don't know if it was one there, but I do remember going to Woolworths as a child.
What kind of stuff do you remember they had in the store?
I just remember it was kind of like a department store. We had a store called Hills at one time. Y'all might not remember that, but it's kind of like like Roses. It was kind of like a Roses.
Woolworths, yeah. So it was not just in Greensboro though, was it?
Right. So Woolworths, so just like Martin was just saying, like there were Woolworths all over the place. So there are Woolworths in Roanoke, Virginia. There are Woolworths in New York City. It was a national chain that was across the country. So they did that on purpose. They chose Woolworths deliberately because it was a store that everyone, most everyone would recognize. So if you see this on the news, you see a headline, it's students are sitting in at the Woolworths, that's going to mean something to someone, even if you're not in Greensboro. So if they had done just like a little local store, it wouldn't have been as clear to people outside of Greensboro, sort of what was happening. They wouldn't have been able to picture what kind of store it is. So
almost like if we were to use Walmart, like if someone was to do a sit-in at Walmart.
Yes, and we would we all know, yeah. We all know what Walmart's like. We all know we have a Walmart somewhere in our town. So we would be able to immediately understand what was happening because we know what that store is.
And it was brilliant too. I mean, I think just because, a national chain like that, the economic, attention they were trying to get. I mean, if they were taking those seats up, then that means other people couldn't get those seats, right?
Yep.
And so they weren't making the money and so they were trying to get people's attention in whatever way. And so to me, that planning and the understanding of we got to hit people where it hurts just so they can understand. Absolutely. Yep. Show me the money, right? But
always the pocketbook, always the money.
But yeah, if I'm sitting at the lunch counter and you're refusing to serve me, then you're not giving me a cup of coffee, you're not giving me a slice of pie, so I'm not paying you for that. Where somebody else sitting here might be ordering food from you, might be paying for that food. So if you choose not to serve us, you're just hurting yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That was definitely part of the impact that they were planning for, that it would be a lot of pressure on the stores because it would really affect the store's bottom line, like how much money they were bringing in during this period.
Which is amazing. And so day after day, and it wasn't a quick thing, which, in my head, it was always like, hey, this was one day and then it was over. And then everyone was like, okay, we agree with you.
Yeah.
Like day after day after day for 6 months at least, until before Woolworths actually decided to change some things. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. So it spread all over. It spread to different stores. So it spread to Woolworths in lots of different cities and towns, and it spread to different stores that had similar setup or had similar rules about who could or couldn't be served in a space. So there were other stores in Greensboro that started to have people come in and sit in, but it really quickly spread across the South because it was such a kind of accessible way to perform this kind of activist work. It didn't require, you didn't have to write a big speech. You didn't have to work with your local government and get permits for a march or a parade or something. All it required was having a group of people who understood the risks that they were taking, but were willing to go sit in these spaces and draw attention to these unjust practices. And anybody could do it. Anybody could go and decide that they were going to support this movement and go occupy these spaces all across the country. So it was something that you could replicate it really, really easily. And because it had such an impact in Greensboro, a lot of people did replicate it. A lot of people said, okay, well, we're doing this in Raleigh. Okay, well, we're doing this in Nashville. And it was something that idea was so easy to get off the ground that it was something that could spread really quickly. So easy to get off the ground, but I don't want that to sound like it was just an idea and whatever, this was easy. They chose that strategy for those purposes. They chose to use the sit-ins as a strategy because it was something that they could do without involving other, institutions or organizations. And it was something that especially college students across the country would be able to replicate. They studied other sit-ins that had happened beforehand, and like this was a really conscious decision. It wasn't an accident. It was the result of really careful organization and really careful planning.
Yeah. And this is what I was hoping that we could focus on too, because when we study history, and those four gentlemen that started off, and what were their names? Do you have their names? And
yes.
I should have written those down. I'm gonna put you on the spot.
Joseph McNeil and David Richmond, Ezell Blair, whose name is now Jabril Kazan, I think. And then, let me make sure I'm telling you this right. And then Franklin McCain.
Very good. And so these four guys, they're the faces of this movement. I mean, they're the ones that when you hear Greensboro Sit-In, you think of these four gentlemen. There's, I know you taught me, you were saying there was like a statue on A&T's campus with the four men. There's that famous photo that we see. But, it took more than just those four men for all of this to happen. When we look at history, a lot of times we focus on a couple of the figures, right? I mean, Martin Luther King, right? Rosa Parks. But were those the only people that were involved? We know that there's going to be hundreds of people that helped support Martin Luther King, right? There's tons of people that helped, with Rosa Parks and that whole situation. Yeah. And so was there a similar type of, tell us about the background or how that got started, and why are we only hearing about the four gentlemen?
Yeah, so you're exactly right that this happens in across all of these kinds of events. Rosa Parks was a highly trained activist. We hear the story just like, oh, she was just a tired seamstress and she was just like, I'm not moving. No, Rosa Parks was really highly trained. Rosa Parks was specifically selected to do that because of who she was and the job she had and the fact that she was going to be a sympathetic figure. All of this was deliberate, and there's organizations and whole groups of people who are behind all of these things. And it is exactly the same for the Greensboro Sit-In. So the idea originated with a group of women at Bennett College, at that historically Black women's college that I mentioned. So the sit-ins the four guys from A&T start the sit-ins on February 1st, 1960. But the semester before that, so their fall semester of 1959, was when the women at Bennett, they had a student group, like a student chapter of the NAACP, which was another civil rights organization. They had a student chapter at Bennett, and they wanted very badly to find something that they could do in Greensboro. So in their college classes, they're talking about segregation, they're talking about all of these systemic injustices, and they're learning about it. But often, and I say this as a college professor, and you're talking about it in a classroom and you're understanding it, which is super important, but that can sometimes feel frustrating when you see a really clear problem. Just sitting and talking about it in your college classroom doesn't necessarily do anything to change it. So they wanted to find some way to take some really direct action and actually change some of these issues that they were learning about in their classes. And a lot of these women came from communities where this kind of activism was just part of the way that the community operated. So it's also not like this was the first time that they had considered doing something like this. A lot of them came from families, came from towns where they had seen this kind of action before, and they understood the power of this kind of activist work. So it's important to recognize the influence that their school had, but also just to recognize the influence that like their home communities had, and just the experience of being a Black person in Jim Crow. I mean, it's, you know, it's not like it was a surprise what was happening. They were living this every single day and like living through these systemic injustices every day. They had a really intimate understanding of what that was like and what that does to a person's life, how it constrains a person's life. So they're in their student chapter of the NAACP, and they started studying what other college groups, other groups similar to theirs had done. And they focused on there was a NAACP group in Oklahoma City that had done a sit-in that had actually, you know, gotten some traction, gotten some change to happen. And so they sort of zeroed in on that as an example. So just like other students learned from what they did in Greensboro, these students in Greensboro, these women at Bennett, were learning from what students had done in another place. So they come up with this plan. They decided they wanted it to be at the Woolworths because of all the reasons we talked about before, why doing it at that chain was really an important decision. So it's the fall of 1959, and they go to the president of their college. So Bennett's pretty small, so students could go talk to the president. So the president at the time was a woman named Dr. Willoughby Player. And she was really supportive of the students' activism and had been for a long time. But she had a piece of advice for them, which was, what if you waited until we come back for the spring semester before you start this? Because they were getting toward the end of the fall semester, toward the end of 1959. And then just like we do now, a lot of students would go home for winter break. They didn't all necessarily live in Greensboro. And so they were getting on the train and going back home, and they would be gone for a couple of weeks or a month. And Dr. Player sort of was looking ahead and said, you know, if you really get this thing going and then everybody goes home for break, you're going to lose all that momentum. So what if we wait until the spring? And they thought that was a good idea. Like that made sense as a kind of tactical choice. And so they started bringing other students into these conversations, into these kind of big planning and organization meetings. And students from A&T started coming into their group, started working on this planning with them. And several people who were part of this group at Bennett have said that those 4 guys were all part of those organizational meetings at one point or another. So this is not to say that the idea hadn't also occurred to them, or they hadn't also been thinking of trying to find a way that they could do something, that they could make a change. You know, these ideas can come from multiple places and then kind of converge, which is what seems to have happened here. But a lot of the really specific choices, and then the organization that was there to support the sit-ins once they started, a lot of that is due to the work that the women at Bennett did. So, you know, being able to say like, okay, our student body already knows about this, is like ready to jump in and support, is ready to come, you know, take their shift at Woolworths. That doesn't just happen, you know, out of the blue. That was something that was a result of these months of really careful study and really careful planning.
As you speak, Dr. Brown, you know, I'm listening to all of the different things you're talking about as far as like Bennett College and you know, being a female college and, you know, women's college and stuff like this. So it sounds like you focus a lot of your research on writing and writing on the women that help organize the sit-in. Why is this important to you?
Well, it's important to me because I think it's such an incredible story. And because I grew up in North Carolina. So, you know, I remember when I was in 4th grade and I'm learning state history, you know, I knew the sit-in story and I knew about the 4 guys, just like everybody else does. I had seen those images and I kind of had that in my head. When I was an undergrad, I went to UNC Greensboro, and I started working on a project with one of my professors there, Hepzibah Ross Kelly, who was doing a project alongside some folks at Bennett where we were researching the history of women's activism and civic engagement at both schools, because Greensboro was a women's college until the 60s. So we were kind of doing these parallel research projects, and I remember hearing about the women who were part of the sit-ins from some of the Bennett folks, and then I saw a talk given by Linda Brown, Dr. Linda Brown, who was at Bennett during the sit-ins and participated in the sit-ins, and then later became a professor at Bennett. And she gave a talk about these women. She's telling, basically the story that, I'm relaying to you now. So then when I got to grad school, I was really interested in this history, and I started learning more and more about rhetoric. And I got really curious about exactly that question that you were asking, like, why do we know the story of these 4 guys, but we don't know the story of these women? So I don't want to suggest for a second that like I discovered this. I did not. I encountered this information from other people.
I thought we had one.
Like I encountered this information from other people who worked really hard to make sure that this information was available. And then the piece of work that I have done is try to use what I know about rhetoric, what I know about communication, what I know about how we memorialize our pasts and the important effects that can have, to try to figure out, okay, well, like what was going on here, and why hasn't this story about these women been told in a more public way? Like, why haven't they gotten that same kind of celebration that the guys from A&T have gotten?
And I love, and I think, how do you communicate stuff? I think we as people, there's a lot of research and stuff on this, but about stories being a great way to share ideas, to share history, to share concepts. And I think that's why our minds work well in groups. Yeah. Right. And so like we group things. And so I think that's why it's easy for us to say, okay, well, there's 4 men, and I can understand this whole idea because I can understand there's 4 men. If I said there were 4,000 men and I had to know all their names and all that stuff, then it just gets all confusing, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why it's so important, I think. And that's why we probably only, learn about, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And we don't know all the presidents, but we know some of the main ones that did some of these things.
Exactly.
But I love the fact that that doesn't mean that those other people don't count. Right. And sometimes their stories might inspire other things that these 4 men may not do, right? But we're living history, and which means we don't even today, like what part can we help with what's going on in our lives, right? I mean, how can we support something that we really care about, or can we make a difference? And if we understand that it was more than just the people we know about that made a difference, then that inspires me a little bit to say, I can make a difference today. I don't have to be the richest person. I don't have to be the most famous person, whatever. I can still make a difference because really the reality is in history, there's a lot more people that were together that caused a difference, a change than just 4 people.
Right. There's all kinds of roles that people play, and we usually focus on whoever is the most out front. So the 4 guys who were the first ones who, the story kind of centers around them. We focus on them because there's only so much detail that can be included in, the newspaper story that ran on February 2nd, 1960 can only say so much. The stories that ran on February 3rd and February 4th and February 5th can only say so much. So it's inevitably, the historical record is always going to be limited, just because it's literally not possible for any of these venues that we tend to communicate through. It's not possible to record absolutely everything. And then as time goes on and you get like the statue of the 4 guys at A&T, it's not possible to put every single person who is in the sit-ins on that statue. Like we're limited by just what we can clearly communicate. And then also what people can, like you said, what stories are going to resonate, what stories are we going to be able to grab onto. So something that's really important about the sit-ins is that sort of move to let those 4 guys be kind of the center of the story and be the sort of faces and the figures that were were really the focus of a lot of the public attention, they knew that was happening. The women at Bennett knew that was happening. It wasn't like they were like, oh, what's going on? How come? Why isn't my picture in the newspaper? They saw that was happening, and of course, I think a lot of them probably would have loved to get more credit at that moment, but they recognized and they understood that the way this story is going to circulate most effectively, the way it's going to get the most attention, is with these kind of central figures, with these 4 guys who have a really great story and who, acted with such bravery. And that's something that people can get really excited about and people can kind of rally behind. Like, that's a more exciting story to tell than, well, there were a lot of meetings for a lot of months.
More.
Yes, okay, great. But so in that moment, it was really beneficial to have this kind of exciting version of the story that could replicate really quickly, that could get other people excited, that could get other people to say like, okay, yeah, let's do that here. But the women from Bennett have said that, they knew it was happening at that moment, but they figured, okay, what's most important right now is getting this change to happen. And I'm sure, it will be incorporated into the story later on, once this kind of, we're not right in the middle of it. And so the women have said that it was sort of surprising to them that for so long they haven't been made part of that story, because it was 61 years ago now. Like, it's been a really long time. Yeah. And for quite a long time there wasn't very much information about what they did. There wasn't very much attention on what they did. So the women themselves started to do the work to really like put themselves back in that historical record. So Linda Brown, who I mentioned before, has written a couple of books about Bennett. She interviewed.
You shared some quotes with me. Do you mind if I share?
Yeah.
Awesome. I have those. And so Laura sent me a couple of quotes because we like quotes around here.
Absolutely.
And so Linda Brown is a name she's thrown out a couple of times. And one thing she said is, she says, as women of Bennett, we did not think about having to validate our role later in history. It is only as the years went on that we realized we were less and less a part of the official story. So at that time, they weren't really worried about that. That's not their purpose, right? Is what she's saying.
And it's like, that wasn't what was important. What was important at the moment was like fighting against segregation and getting these laws and these rules changed. They weren't sitting there thinking like, how will history remember me? They were just thinking like, I want to be treated like as an equal person and with respect when I go into this business that I regularly give my money to. Like, that was the thing that mattered. They weren't sitting there thinking like, I wonder if I'll get a statue one day.
I think there's been talk about them making a statue of Mr. Burbank.
Oh,
I heard the rumor.
I wonder
now, where would they put that statue? Where would be a good place to put that? Outside of Taco Bell. Like, I love that.
Right outside of Taco Bell. Yeah, right outside.
Now here's the real question: is it going to be one of those like super larger than life statues, or is it going to be one of the ones that like you're actually only like 2 feet tall?
Oh no, it's going to be one of the big.
I am really just only 2 foot tall in real life.
So it would be the most accurate.
It's going to be one of those inflatables that they have in the car salesman places.
That feels like that would really capture your energy. I feel like that's appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let me ask another question. So, okay. And I want to. So I love the fact that we're learning that there was just a group of people that did this. Why do you think the fact? And I think one of the main things about this Greensboro Sit-In that was so important was the fact, and they harped on it so much, and they created this plan of nonviolence.
Yes.
That this has to be a nonviolent thing. My understanding is they prepared way beforehand of like how people would treat them, what people would say to them, and that they weren't going to look them in the eye because they didn't want people to, oh, you're disrespecting me, or, they weren't going to talk back. They were just going to be calm. They were going to be respectful. But they were going to be firm on what they were asking for and hold their ground. There's a great book, and I can put it about this, and I'll put in the notes below. But it's an idea. It's called, I think, standing up, or the idea. I think what the verbiage in there is saying they're standing up by sitting down. Mm-hmm. And so, but that sitting down, being quiet, being respectful is a huge part of having nonviolence. Why was that important part of this puzzle? Do you think that helped things, or if they were violent, do you think that would have changed things?
So in this particular moment, in this particular setting, like I think nonviolence was a specific choice. I mean, that's the sit-in itself, like that kind of activist strategy is a nonviolent strategy. And there were lots of organizations in the civil rights movement that were specifically trying to create change using these nonviolent strategies. So a lot of times we associate nonviolence with Martin Luther King. So the organization that he worked most closely with, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they really emphasized like doing this kind of activist work through nonviolent means. And for the goals that they wanted to accomplish in the Woolworths, they wanted to point out the injustice of creating these rules about who can and can't sit and order a cup of coffee. And they wanted to make that economic impact on the businesses that we talked about. Like they had really specific ideas for really specific expectations for the kinds of effects that this particular strategy would have. It's kind of complicated to think about that idea of like making sure that they looked respectful, which is like they were good college students, like they were already, no matter what they were doing, people who were worthy of respect. But they knew that they were going to be scrutinized by white audiences who were really critical of them. And so they made a decision to act in a way that they knew wouldn't create opportunities for that really that hostile white audience to criticize them. So they were really carefully thinking about like, okay, what are people going to, what kind of buttons are they going to be trying to push? What kind of threats are they going to be making against us? And they made that really careful decision to, all right, we're going to act in a way that they're not going to be able to criticize us for our behavior. We're going to sit there. They brought their schoolwork, like people were doing their homework and reading and studying. Like you said, like they weren't starting confrontations with the people who were there to try to intimidate them. Because you see pictures of the sit-ins and the stores are filled with angry white people standing behind the students, trying to get them to get up, trying to get them to move, throwing stuff at them, pouring stuff on them, pouring the sugar and salt canisters, threatening violence. There are stories about, one of the women says she, felt a knife pressed up against her back at one point. Like this was a really dangerous thing for them to be doing. And so they wanted to be really careful about interacting with what they knew would be a group of angry, hostile white people. They wanted to be really careful about interacting in a way that there wasn't going to be opportunities to put any blame on the students, because they knew that those people would want to blame the students, right? Like those people were looking for a way to blame these students for something going wrong or for something really bad happening as a result of this. And so they decided, and they trained, like they practiced for it. There's a group in Nashville that started a sit-in shortly after Greensboro, and there are all kinds of stories about like the training that they did to try to make sure that they were prepared to sit there with people yelling at them and pouring things on them and harassing them, and that they were going to be able to stay there and feel calm. And they also train how to keep each other safe, how to work together as a group and try to keep each other safe in what was potentially an incredibly dangerous situation.
I think that, when you talked about them training, like I never even imagined anything like that. I just figure, that they just go in and just do what they do. But I can only imagine like how we talked about college students, 18, 17, 19,
Yeah.
Something like that, leaving home, being in a new place, some of them, and then having that on you, and then be able to, have the mindset an early age,
Yeah.
about what's going on in the world or what's going on in your community or in the States or whatever, and then be able to actively do something about it. And then training part, as far as them actually going to train, like I'm, as you're talking, not to not listen, I'm still focused, but at the same time, my mind was like, I can only imagine like what they were doing during the training, like what they kind of put themselves through in order to be able to deal with those things when they actually happen. Because when you're in a training environment, it's different because sometimes you can't always replicate the actual event.
Right.
And when because they may have been backstage or, where they were at doing these things, but then when it happens for real and someone actually presses a knife up against your back or someone actually pours sugar or salt in your head, how are you going to really be able to act then? And we tend to focus on just one or two characters of importance in various parts of history. Is this the way we document history? So is the way we document history flawed, or is this the best way for people like us who didn't experience an event to understand it without being overwhelmed? And I may have jumped, and if I did, I apologize.
No, that makes total sense to me. So like, you're the way you're describing that, like you're really thinking about like what it took for all of these students who participated in this. So we recognize the ways that those first four guys were incredibly brave and were doing something really brave. When you look at all of the work that went into other people who went and joined the sit-in, when you understand the risk that they were taking on and the dangerous situation that they were putting themselves into, that they were knowingly putting themselves into, we see all of those, the bravery of all of those students, of all of those people. So it is really frustrating then that why don't we know all their names? Why don't we know all their faces? Like they all did something that was really incredible. So, we were talking earlier about how this makes it seem like, this helps us realize that there's lots of different roles that a person can play in creating change. But I don't want that to dismiss the fact that like what they all did was really incredible and still took real courage and took real bravery. So is the way that we record that history flawed because we don't know all their names and we don't know all their faces? I would say that it's flawed, but it's kind of inevitably flawed. Like we're always going to be leaving something out. So one of the things that we can do as students of history as we're learning more about this history is get into the practice of asking, okay, well, like who's not in this story? Or, okay, this story is really focusing on these four guys. Like, what does that tell me about what was happening at that moment? Or what does that tell me about what was happening 20, 30 years later when people were making statues for these guys? Like, what does that tell me about what that community or that culture or that group or that institution, what does it tell me about like what they valued or what they saw as most important? So 1960, obviously there's racial inequality, but there's also really significant gender inequality. And these things all still exist today. But, in the 60s, like women couldn't have their own credit cards unless it was like under their husband's name. So there's all kinds of like legal limitations on women at that point in time too. And so for Black women, it's double. It's all of these things on top of each other. And if you don't have a lot of money, it's class on top of it too. It's class inequality on top of it too. All of these things are intersecting for these women. So when we see that, okay, the story really rallies around these four guys, like partly it's because they were the first ones. That was a really dramatic moment, like, of course, and we should focus on them. But also it tells us a little bit about, okay, what was happening at that time, that everyone was so ready to focus on these guys. And that in that moment, there weren't reporters saying, hey, I'm curious about how these women and what, like, let me go talk to them. Let me go seek them out. You can learn a little bit about where someone's attention was focused based on the kind of story that gets told. So what I've tried to do with this story, but also just with any kind of histories that I'm learning about or that I'm encountering, is to kind of get in the habit of asking those questions, like, okay, who are they focusing on here, or what are they focusing on here, and what does that tell me about the values and what was important at this moment in time, and who is maybe not there, like where else could I look that these narratives don't seem to be paying attention to, like who else might I look for, what other stories might there be, and then hopefully we find something like the work that these women from Bennett have done to write these books and record these interviews. Like they've created the documentation that we need to understand their contribution. So hopefully we find that information. Sometimes we don't, and that's sad, but also, again, inevitable. Like just no matter what we do, it's going to be really complicated. There's no like super easy answer or like right best way to record something in the historical record. It's just a matter of us thinking about, okay, like what power dynamics are at play here, and what other questions could I ask, and like where else could I look, and what am I going to do with the tensions between those questions and those answers.
And I know, like for me, I have one more question. And then I know Mr. Burbank may have some more questions, but my last question is, why is it important that these women get recognized?
Because they did something so incredible.
Yes, absolutely. I love that answer. I love that answer.
But
and even if you left it like that, I would be totally okay with it.
Yes. So I mean, I think that is the most basic answer, is like they did something so incredible and they absolutely deserve to be celebrated, and like we should all be in awe of them and what they did. But the other reason is to try to correct some of those historical imbalances. So at that moment, people aren't paying much attention to the women. In lots of moments, people aren't paying much attention to women. People aren't paying as much attention to people of color. People aren't paying as much attention to poor people or people with disabilities. Like going in
communities.
Yes, yeah, like the list goes on and on and on. So we can see, you can usually see pretty clearly in the historical record, like who had power, who had the power to record their stories, and just who was everybody interested in paying the most attention to. So when we go in and we see a story like this about the Bennett women, paying attention to them and really lifting up that story is a way of kind of starting to correct that particular injustice, like that historical imbalance. Like we're saying, okay, we think it's really important to also lift up the stories of women and to celebrate the activism of women, not just the activism of men who are often seen in those like, front lines activist roles. Like by making that move, we're saying we think what they did was important too, and we're kind of we're tipping the scales back in their favor just a little bit.
And I love the fact that today we're asking, we have people like you, Laura, that are asking questions about, well, what about these women? And what about, let's give them a voice, we're continuing that voice. There's a lot of people out there. So thank you for giving that voice to those and allowing us to hear stories that we might have not heard otherwise, or making that a little bit more known. I think that's really important.
And so we can use that to look at things that are happening now too. As we see something in the news or in the paper or online, like that is eventually going to become the historical record, right? Like the reporting that we're seeing about what's happening around the country, what's happening around the world, give it some time. Like that's our historical record. That's what people are going to look back at as, well, what was in the paper? What was on the news? What were people talking about? How were they talking about it? So especially right now when we know we're living in what's going to be a pretty significant historical moment. Like we're always living in history, but right now we know like something big is going on that's like going to be in the textbooks. We can,
all of 2020 will be in the textbook.
Exactly. And so like,
or we're just going to wipe it out and say, no,
yeah,
don't bother.
2019 to 2021. They're like, what?
We just skipped that. It was too much.
The whole year.
But so you can look for how that's happening around you now. Like, okay, like who are they going to talk to about this story? Like, who are they focusing on when they're talking about like the way the pandemic affects people? Who, are they paying attention to different communities, different groups in the same way? Like, where else might I look just to understand like the moment that I'm living in right now, because it's all happening all around us. It's not just something that we have to look at in retrospect. We can look at what stories are being told about things that are going on like this very moment.
Absolutely. And history is nice because, we have hindsight, right? We can make we can fix all the problems because we look back. But I always wonder, it's kind of like you look at pictures of your dad, you're like, I can't believe you wore that, right? That out in public, but that was normal then, right? And now I'm wearing stuff and I'm going to look back on myself today and I'm going to be like, in 30 years, I'm like, I can't believe you wore that.
Right. Oh, look at my hair.
It's not going to take 30 years.
You guys are like, Mr. Burbank.
45. I look at some stuff I wore in the 90s and in the 2000s, and I look at even stuff I wore probably 10 years ago. I'm like, how in the world did I wear that stuff?
Yeah.
And so it's the same thing, but I'm wondering what things are happening today that we're going to look back and we're like, I can't believe we did that. I can't believe we acted like that.
Right.
And some people today, though, are being like, we need change here. I want, I think hopefully we can all leave saying, anyone is able, to make change, right? Anyone, it's not, you have to be the richest, the biggest, but it's nothing it's not the reactionary, right? Because we're seeing that looking at this story, they weren't reactionary. They understood what things were going on around them. They understood the importance of their actions and making sure that their actions were done in a right way. So it wouldn't take off of there's anger. I'm sure there was anger. There was frustration, but they didn't want people to focus on that. They wanted them to focus on what the problem was, right? And sometimes when we react, we don't see what the problem is. We just see the person react and we're like, oh, well, they're just angry. And it's not, there's, we can't anticipate everything that's going to happen. We can't anticipate how we are maybe going to feel in a moment or how other people are going to react to us in a moment, but you can think pretty carefully about what consequences there might be and make a plan of action. And with that kind of careful study and organization, like we saw these students do, they looked at what happened to people who were in a similar situation before them, and they tried to learn from that, and they tried to anticipate what might happen and prepare themselves as best they could. So we can't always have a perfect plan. I mean, like we all know that, I can't get through one day in the way that I imagine I'm going to. But you can make a plan and you can prepare yourself to try to be as successful in the aspects that you have control over. Love it. Love it. Laura, I know we've talked about a lot of different things. We could probably keep talking to you for hours and hours, but they wouldn't mind listening to you. But Mr. Martin and they don't probably want to hear us anymore.
I don't think that's true.
I think that's the case too. She came out here and super shined, and I loved it.
She is spectacular. So fun. Thank you for doing that. As we go, what if you could have one takeaway that you would like, people that are just listening, what would that one takeaway be? That's a tough one. I think
those questions about history are that's the takeaway that really applies to any situation. Obviously, to what we're talking about with the sit-ins, but to anything in the historical record. To kind of get in the habit of asking, okay, who's here, or what's here, and why, but also who's maybe not here, and what are we missing, or what else, what other directions could I look in, and what else might I be able to learn, or how might I actually better be able to understand the complexity of the situation. I think just having those questions always kind of working in the back of your mind. It's, good critical thinking, but consuming these kind of historical narratives with that critical perspective.
I love it. And since those were your words, I would love for you to leave us today, if you don't mind, saying, and you can quote me on that.
Let me do it with my mug.
Yep. Oh, there we go. Oh, yes. Let's take a drink real quick and honor. Hey, let's cheers. Awesome job.
And you can quote me on that.
Yeah. I love it.
You don't have to take that. You don't edit none of that. Leave that.
Absolutely. That is all going
like it is.